The scaffold boards were still wet from the night's rain when they led her up. The sound they made, that soft particular give of damp wood under leather soles, is not recorded anywhere in the surviving court documents, but the rain itself is. Worcester County records note it, almost as an afterthought beside the proceedings. Morning of the 2nd of July, 1778. Overcast, ground wet. 4 condemned, and Bathsheba Spooner, 32 years old, the first woman the government of the United States of America would ever execute, climbing those boards with her hands bound and her belly carrying what the new republic had officially decided did not exist. She had petitioned twice. The petitions survive. In the first, dated the 22nd of June, she wrote in her own hand, a firm, educated hand, the kind of penmanship that cost money to acquire, that she was quick with child, and that the law of both England and the infant nation recognized the right of a pregnant woman to have her execution stayed until after delivery. The petition was denied. She submitted a second, the wording more urgent, the lines less composed. Denied again. A panel of 12 men, physicians, not midwives, though several subsequent accounts have elided that distinction, conducted an examination and returned their verdict. Not pregnant, not quick. The execution would proceed as scheduled. What those 12 men failed to find, or chose not to find, is the fixed point around which everything in this story turns. The autopsy report, signed by Dr. William Whiting and preserved in the historical record, is a document of cold economy. A male fetus, approximately 5 months of gestation, viable had circumstances permitted. Bathsheba Spooner had been telling the truth. Her body had been telling the truth. The panel had looked, conducted a formal examination, returned a formal verdict, and been wrong in a way that the record now makes indefensible. 247 years on. But we are not there yet. The rope is not yet fitted. We have time still to understand how a woman of education and property arrived on that scaffold in the damp July morning, and whether what was done to her there can be called justice, or whether it was something the new nation needed to call justice because the alternative was a reckoning it was not ready for. Go back. Further back than the arrest, further than the lover and the plan and the body in the well. Go back to the father, because the father is where this story begins to acquire its particular shape. Timothy Ruggles was a man who accumulated weight, not in the physical sense. No description of his appearance survives that dwells on bulk, but the specific gravitational mass of a man who has been appointed to things, trusted with things, who has sat in rooms where decisions of consequence were made, and has made them with the confidence of someone who has never seriously considered that he might be wrong. He had served as a brigadier general under the Crown. He had been president of the Stamp Act Congress of 1765, which meant he had sat in that assembly of colonial delegates in New York and watched them refuse, one by one, to endorse any resolution that resembled collaboration with parliamentary authority, and then, when the moment came to sign, had refused himself. He was the only delegate to do so. The other delegates noticed. So did the newspapers. His neighbors in Hardwick, Massachusetts, noticed with a particular intensity, and when the Revolution arrived with its comprehensive rearrangements of loyalty, they did not forget. His estate was confiscated. He was driven north to Nova Scotia with what he could carry, which was considerable in terms of portable property and personal conviction, and not much else. He settled. He would go on to receive land grants from the Crown, to establish a community of loyalist exiles, to live into his 80s, a man who had lost everything and rebuilt something from the remainder, which required a particular quality of stubbornness that his daughter, the record suggests, had inherited. He left her behind. Whether this was simply the mathematics of exile, a daughter grown, married, unable to travel with an infant and a household, or whether there was something between them that made the leaving easier, the record will not say. Bathsheba was not the only child Timothy left in Massachusetts, but she is the one the record follows. She was 20 when he departed. She had been married for 4 years. Bathsheba Ruggles was born in 1746, the eldest of Timothy's children, in a household of considerable substance, and, the evidence suggests, considerable pressure. The Ruggles property in Hardwick was among the larger holdings in Worcester County. She received an education that went beyond the domestic. The French she was said to speak, the handwriting the petitions preserve, the evident comfort with legal argument, which reflects both her father's means and his particular vision of what a daughter of his ought to be capable of. Whether she was formed in his image or against it, whether she took his certainties as inheritance or as a shape she spent her life pressing against, is something the record permits speculation about, but does not resolve. What can be resolved? In 1766, at the age of 20, she married Joshua Spooner. The marriage record exists in the Brookfield Parish Register. The ink is brown with age. The entry is brief. The names, the date, the officiant. What it cannot convey is anything about the quality of what was arranged, because marriage records in the 18th century were not designed to convey quality. They recorded the legal fact. The emotional fact was someone else's business, or no one's. Joshua Spooner was substantially older. The record of his birth is unclear. The precise year has not been conclusively established. But contemporary accounts place him in his mid-40s at the time of the marriage, making him more than 20 years her senior. He was a man of property, which was the primary qualification. He owned a substantial house on the road through Brookfield, and land enough to constitute a future. He was a loyalist. This would matter enormously after 1775. And he was a reasonable match, in the calculus of 1766, for a loyalist's educated daughter. Whether Bathsheba had been consulted about any of this is not a question the record bothers to address. It rarely did. What the record does indicate, in the oblique form of testimony gathered later, is the texture of what followed. Several neighbors, deposed in the weeks after the murder, described Joshua Spooner in terms that circled carefully around specific condemnation, but accumulated into a portrait nonetheless. One deponent used the word disagreeable. A second described him as a man who drank with some regularity, and not in the celebratory fashion. A third, more carefully, said only that Mrs. Spooner appeared unhappy. A fourth, a woman who had known the household for some years, testified that she had never in her observations seen any great affection between them. Read together, these depositions sketch a household that had settled into a kind of cold, deliberate misery, the kind that does not announce itself but simply occupies the rooms, sits at the table, lies in the bed, makes the air of a house heavier in a way that guests feel when they cross the threshold, and hosts have long ceased to notice. They had 4 children. The children appear in the record only as presents, enumerated in depositions, noted in court documents, their existence acknowledged in the way one acknowledges furniture. What became of them after their mother's arrest and their father's death is a matter the record addresses only in the vaguest terms. Absorbed, presumably, into the households of relatives, the specific arrangements undocumented. Their names and fates do not survive in any source that has come to light. This is itself a kind of record. The things we lose, because no mechanism existed to preserve them, are as much a part of the archive as what remains. The smell of wet wool and wood ash, and underneath it, the mineral sharpness of a New England winter trying to get through the walls. This is the atmosphere into which Ezra Ross walked on a day in the winter of 1777. He was traveling. The records establish him as a soldier in the Continental Army, a young man from a family of no particular distinction, serving in one of the Massachusetts regiments during a period when the war required everything the colonies could feed into it. He was moving through Brookfield, southward, the accounts suggest, making his way from one station to another. And he was ill, sick enough that he was visibly struggling, sick enough to be noticed. What happened next is documented in its bare fact. Bathsheba Spooner took him in. Whether she encountered him on the road herself, or heard of him from a neighbor who flagged his condition, the precise mechanism of introduction is not preserved. What is preserved is the result. He was brought into the Spooner house. He was given a bed, or something that served as one. He was given warm food, which in a Massachusetts winter in 1777 would have been the particular sustaining warmth of things cooked over a fire. Bean soup thick enough to resist a spoon, salt pork, bread that was honest rather than delicate. And he recovered. The recovery took time, and the time passed in the Spooner house, and Bathsheba was in the house. He was 18 years old, perhaps 19. The exact date of his birth creates a small uncertainty in the record. His Continental Army enlistment papers, filed by a young man from a modest family, describe him in terms of utility rather than character, height, age, fitness for service. The depositions taken after his arrest fill in some of what the enlistment form omits. He was described by more than one person who had known him in the months before the murder as obliging. This is the word that recurs. Obliging, and young, and present in a house where presence itself was unusual. One witness described him as having a quality that she struggled to name before settling on an easy manner. Another said he was pleasing in his address. A third was less generous and more direct, the kind of boy a woman in her situation might find appealing, which is the deponent's own language, and carries within it both a judgment of Bathsheba and a recognition of what her situation was. He stayed longer than his recovery required. This, too, is documented, in the general fact, if not in the specific days. Witnesses noted that his presence in the Spooner household extended well past the point at which his illness could have detained him. What kept him is not recorded in any document that survives as a direct statement from either of them. But the body has its own documents, and one of them is a pregnancy that, by the time of the arrest in March of 1778, had been developing for approximately 5 months, dating back to October or perhaps late September. The leaves in Brookfield that autumn would have been the full New England riot, the particular saturated reds and ochres of maple and oak in the hills of Worcester County, and the house would have smelled of dried apples and wood smoke and the closing in of the year. What she understood about what was beginning between them, the record will not say. What is clear is that she was 31 years old, that the house she had been living in for 11 years was cold in ways no hearth could address, and that he was 18, and alive in the way that young men who have survived battle are sometimes startlingly alive. That particular excessive presence, that sharpened quality of being that proximity to death can produce in those it spares. I wish to God Joshua was out of the world. The phrase, or something very close to it, appears in depositions from more than one witness. She said it to Ezra Ross. She appears to have said it to at least one other person in her orbit during the winter of 1777. Whether she meant it, in those first sayings, as a genuine expression of murderous intent, or as the kind of thing that a person in a miserable marriage says, in the way they also say, "I wish this winter would end," a release of pressure rather than a plan, is something the record cannot now determine. What it can determine is that she said it more than once, and that saying it more than once gave it weight, and that at some point between the first saying and the last, it crossed the interior line between wish and intention. The cross-examination record from the April trial contains an exchange worth recording here. The examining counsel asked Ezra Ross when he had first understood what Mrs. Spooner intended. Ross's answer, as transcribed in the court record, was this: "She had said it so many times I suppose I began to think she was in earnest." A moment's pause in the transcript. No court transcripts of the period indicate pauses, but the sentence invites one. "And when you understood she was in earnest," counsel continued, "what did you do?" "I said I would help her," Ross answered. God forgive me. I said I would help her. He was 18 or 19 years old. He had already survived at least one engagement of the Revolution. He had been sick and been nursed and had fallen into something that the law and the court and the assembled press of Worcester County all called, with varying degrees of condemnation, a seduction. Whether he was seduced in the sense the word implied, a young man led by an older woman into choices he would not otherwise have made, or whether he made his choices with the agency available to an adult who has been told clearly what is being asked of him, is a question the record allows but does not answer. He said he would help her. He found James Buchanan and William Brooks. Buchanan and Brooks are the figures in this story who resist being known. They are present in every document as names attached to actions, and the actions are specific and documented, but the persons behind the actions have left almost no impression on the surviving record beyond what was necessary to convict them. What can be established: they were British soldiers. The accounts differ on their precise status: deserters from one source, prisoners of war awaiting exchange from another, the distinction legally and militarily significant in ways that the documents do not pause to clarify. They were in the vicinity of the Spooner property in the winter months of 1777 to 1778, accessible to Ezra Ross in ways the record does not fully explain, but suggests were not unusual given the informal and often chaotic nature of prisoner management and soldier movement during this period of the war. They were willing. This is documented. How much they were told, whether they understood they were being asked to commit murder, rather than some less precisely defined act of violence or intimidation, whether the sum offered. The record indicates some payment was discussed, though the amount is not consistently preserved across sources. Whether all of that constituted informed consent or simple mercenary willingness, the record holds but does not adjudicate. "They came because I asked them," Ross said in the same April transcript. "I do not think they fully understood what I was asking. I am not certain I fully understood what I was asking." This is the single humanizing statement in the record about Ezra Ross, a young man who was perhaps further along the road to murder than his own mind had clearly registered, until the night the road ended in a Brookfield yard in the dark. The night of February the 28th, moving into the 1st of March, 1778, is where the record becomes specific in the way that only criminal records are specific: the precision of documented horror. Joshua Spooner had been in town. The testimony of the tavern keeper at Brookfield confirms this. He had been present that evening, drinking in the company of others, in the particular atmosphere of a winter tavern: close air, pipe smoke trapped in the low ceiling, the smell of wet wool from the outdoor men who came in from the cold, the specific sourness of hard cider in pewter mugs. He drank enough to be noticed as having drunk. He left late. The house was quiet when he turned toward it, the road dark with that absolute darkness that the 18th century countryside offered. No gaslight, no lantern in every window. Just the last embers of what had been the evening glow from a few houses, and the stars where the overcast allowed them. Bathsheba was inside. What she was doing at that hour, in which room, how she held herself through the waiting. The depositions do not record this, and she did not record it herself. What she knew was that the men were in the yard, and that what she had wished for across a winter and more was, within the next minutes, either going to happen or not happen. She had given Brooks and Buchanan rum. This detail appears in multiple depositions without apparent coordination, which suggests its truth. Rum before a thing like this, the practical psychology of it, the particular management of men toward a commission. It is the detail of a woman who had thought about the practical aspects of what she was arranging. Joshua Spooner came through his own gate. What happened in the yard was not clean. It was not the work of men who had done this before, or who had been given precise instruction. The court record does not use the word clumsy, but the word accumulates itself across the testimonies. Blows that were sufficient to incapacitate, a struggle in the dark, the specific confusion of violence in an unlit yard. Buchanan and Brooks struck him. The blows rendered him incapacitated. And then, in the dark, and the cold of a New England late February night, with the frost still in the ground, and the well still holding its winter chill, they put Joshua Spooner in the well. The coroner's report notes water in the lungs. Whether he was still living when he went in, or whether the blows had already completed the work, is a question the document raises and does not definitively answer. He drowned, or had already been beyond drowning, in the stone-lined cold of his own well on his own property. He was a loyalist, and he was disagreeable, and he had made at least one person very unhappy for a very long time. None of this is mitigation. What is recorded is that a man died in his yard, that his wife was inside the house and knew, and that the morning came and brought with it everything the morning was going to bring. Bathsheba, it is reported by one account, was seen at a window when the sounds in the yard ceased. A faint light, a face briefly visible, and then gone. This detail is not in the court record. It appears in one newspaper account from several weeks after the arrest, and it may be embellishment, the press supplying what drama required. Whether she watched, unknown. Whether she felt what she had expected to feel when the thing she had arranged was finally, irreversibly completed. Whether it was relief, or something colder, or something she had not named. The record will not say. The morning came. A servant made the discovery. The court record names her only as Mary, no surname given, which is itself a record of what the court considered worth preserving. The well gave up what had been given to it: a body, a husband, evidence immediate and entirely insufficient for concealment. The investigation that followed was brief because it needed to be brief, and thorough because the evidence was thorough. Ezra Ross was located within hours. The watch that had been taken from Joshua Spooner, the one misdirecting gesture toward the appearance of a robbery, was found on one of the soldiers. James Buchanan and William Brooks were identified and brought in, and Bathsheba Spooner, the daughter of Timothy Ruggles, the wife of the man in the well, the woman who had been inside the house. She was found in the house, where she had been all along. She had not fled. She had made no evident preparation to flee. Whether this was the paralysis that sometimes follows a crossing of the irreversible line, or a fatalistic clarity, or simply the practical recognition that a woman of her profile in a small town had nowhere to go where she would not be immediately recognizable. The record holds all three possibilities without resolving them. What she said in the initial examination is documented. The constables asked. She told them, "I am the one who desired it done," she said. "I desired it for a long time. The men did as I asked of them." She did not ask them to believe she had done nothing. She asked only, eventually, that they believe she was pregnant. One truth she offered immediately. The other, the one that cost her everything, they declined to accept. The spring of 1778 in Massachusetts was the spring of a war that had survived one winter, and had not yet confirmed it would survive another. The alliance with France had been formally concluded in February, but the practical military implications had not yet materialized on the ground. The French fleet was not in position. The British were in Philadelphia, and the Continental Army, having endured Valley Forge, was reorganizing with whatever it had retained of itself after the cold. The news traveled slowly and arrived in towns like Worcester and Brookfield as a mixture of fact and rumor, and the towns processed it in the way that towns under stress process things, with a heightened attention to local order, to local authority, to the question of what kind of place this was, and what it stood for, and who was in charge of standing for it. The trial of Bathsheba Spooner and her three co-defendants opened in Worcester in April of 1778. The court was the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts, newly constituted, recently renamed, a body that was aware in each session that it was laying down precedents for a legal system that did not yet fully exist. Every ruling it made was simultaneously a legal judgment and a statement about what the law of this new republic would be. The four defendants were tried together: Spooner, Ross, Buchanan, Brooks. The charges were clear: the murder of Joshua Spooner, whose body the well had returned. The evidence was extensive: the watch, the testimony of the neighbors, the depositions of the soldiers themselves, who provided detailed accounts that may have been offered in the hope of leniency, and were not rewarded with it. Bathsheba's legal defense, such as it was conducted in the manner available to a woman in a capital trial in 1778, which is to say it was limited by every structural constraint the period could impose. She had no female advocate, no sympathetic reading of mitigating circumstance, no mechanism by which her 11 years in a difficult marriage could be entered into the record as something other than background. She had the facts of the case, which the prosecution also had. She had her testimony, which she gave clearly and without contradiction, acknowledging her role and her intent in terms that the court found, correctly, sufficient for conviction. What the court did not dwell on, and what the surviving record preserves only in the texture of the depositions, rather than in any formal finding, was the question of how she had arrived there. The cold of the house, the years, the war that had taken her father to Nova Scotia, and left her with Joshua Spooner in a household full of dependents, and no exit that the law recognized as legitimate. These were not mitigating factors in the law of 1778. They are not mitigating factors in the strict legal sense now, but they are part of the record, in the way that a landscape is part of a photograph, not the subject, but the thing that gives the subject its context. Guilty was the verdict for all four. It was returned without extended deliberation. The death sentence was announced and accepted by the court. Execution was set for the 1st of July, later moved by 1 day, 2 months approximately in the Worcester jail. The cell, or the room that served as one, would have held the smell of lime and old stone, and the sourness of bad ventilation that stone buildings in this climate accumulated. And Bathsheba Spooner sat in it and wrote. She wrote 2 petitions. She wrote what may have been other letters, to her father in Nova Scotia, to whatever friends or family were accessible. But if those letters survived, they have not come to light in a way the record preserves with confidence. What survives are the petitions, and they are sufficient to give some sense of how her mind was working in those weeks. The first, submitted on the 22nd of June, is a document of composed legal argument. She did not plead for mercy on grounds of character or circumstance. She did not contest the verdict. She invoked a specific legal principle, one that had roots in English common law and that the new American legal system had not yet formally abrogated, the plea of the belly, as it was sometimes called, which held that a woman condemned to death could claim a stay of execution if she was pregnant, pending an examination by a jury of matrons to confirm the claim. The principle was old. It was established. She cited it clearly. She stated that she was quick with child. She asked the court and then the governor and council to convene the appropriate examination. She asked for time. The petition was reviewed. It was denied. The record of the denial is a brief entry in the council minutes, unelaborated. No reasoning is preserved. The petition was received, considered, and declined, and the execution date was confirmed. She wrote again. The second petition is a different document from the first. It is still her handwriting, but the lines are less steady, not trembling, not the shaking hand of a woman who has given up, but the slightly uneven quality of lines written under a pressure that has become harder to set aside. The argument is the same. The urgency is not. The word beg appears in it. I beg your honors to consider. This is not a word she had used in the first petition. She was not a woman who appeared in any surviving document to use that word easily. This petition was also denied. The governor and council, in response to the 2 petitions, took one step. They appointed a panel of 12 men to conduct an examination and determine whether Bathsheba Spooner was pregnant. These men were physicians. The Old English practice would have required a jury of matrons. Women with practical experience of pregnancy and childbirth, able to assess a woman's condition through the knowledge of people who had attended deliveries, who had felt for fetal movement, who understood what 5 months looked and felt like from the inside of experience. No such jury was convened. Why it was not is unexplained in any document that survives. The possibilities are available for consideration. A revolutionary government might have had ideological reservations about allowing a body of women to exercise an official legal function. The revolution had reorganized many things, but not the fundamental structure of who held authority over determinations of fact. There may have been a practical shortage of experienced midwives willing to present themselves for official service in this capacity. There may have been simple administrative default to the available professional category. The panel of physicians was the thing to hand. Or, and this possibility cannot be elevated above the others, but neither can it be set below them, there may have been an implicit understanding of what verdict was expected, and a selection of examiners more likely to return it. What is recorded is that 12 male physicians were appointed. They conducted their examination. The examination was performed in the Worcester jail, in a room that the record does not describe, in conditions of dignity or indignity that no surviving document addresses. Bathsheba Spooner, 5 months pregnant, was examined by 12 men. She did not record what that examination was like. If she spoke to anyone about it, a jailer, a minister who attended her in her final weeks, a woman allowed to visit, those accounts have not survived in any form that constitutes primary evidence. The record has the before and the after, but not the during. What she experienced in that room, the specific indignity of it, what was done and what was said, how long it lasted, whether any of the 12 men spoke to her with anything that might be called consideration. This is a blank in the archive that the archive will not fill. What emerged from the room was the panel's finding. She was not pregnant, not quick. The execution would proceed as scheduled on the 2nd of July, 1778. The finding was accepted. It was entered into the record. The execution date was confirmed. How do 12 physicians examining a woman 5 months pregnant fail to identify a pregnancy? This is the question the record poses and cannot answer with certainty, and it is worth sitting with the range of what cannot answer with certainty actually contains. 5 months of gestation is, by any standard of obstetric knowledge available in the 18th century, not an ambiguous condition. By approximately 20 weeks, fetal movement, quickening, the specific and legally meaningful threshold, is well established, detectable by the woman herself, and by an experienced examiner with a careful hand, sometimes from outside. The abdomen has changed in ways that are visible and palpable. An examiner who was both experienced and attentive should have had no particular difficulty. The medical education available to American physicians in 1778 was not standardized in any modern sense. There were no licensing boards, no residency programs, no uniform curricula. Men who called themselves physicians ranged from those trained in Edinburgh or London to those who had apprenticed with a country practitioner and learned what that particular practitioner happened to know. The 12 men appointed to examine Bathsheba Spooner were presumably among the more reputable practitioners available in Worcester County, but their specific training in obstetrics, the hands-on, empirical knowledge of pregnancy at various stages, is not documented and cannot be assumed. This is incompetence as a possibility. It is a real one, but incompetence does not fully account for 12 men finding nothing. The political dimension is another possibility, and it is not more comfortable than incompetence. The government of Massachusetts had convicted 4 people of murder, had set an execution date, and had denied 2 petitions for stay. A panel that returned a finding of pregnancy would have been complicating not merely a medical question, but a political schedule. The government had invested in this outcome. The government's need for a clean, prompt demonstration of legal authority. In July of 1778, in a war that was not yet won, with a legal system that was asserting its legitimacy by every act it performed, was real and visible. Whether any of the 12 physicians felt the weight of that need and allowed it to bear on their finding, unknown. Whether some of them found evidence they declined to report, also unknown. The record holds only the finding, not the deliberation that produced it. What can be said with exactness? They were wrong. They returned a verdict that the autopsy table overturned with a finality available only to physical evidence. And a woman was told, in the Worcester jail on some day in the last week of June, that the panel had found nothing, that the execution would proceed, that the state had considered her claim and rejected it. The minister who attended Bathsheba Spooner in her final days was, according to some accounts, the Reverend Thaddeus McCarty of Worcester. What passed between them is not preserved in detail, though it is documented that she received clerical visits and that she made a public confession and statement before her execution, which in the religious culture of the period was both expected, and for the condemned, an opportunity that some used with more sincerity than others. What McCarty reported of her private state in the days between the panel's verdict and the execution was that she was composed but not resigned in any passive sense. She understood she was going to die. She had made her peace with what she had done. The murder, the conspiracy, the drawing of other lives into the orbit of her own decision. She accepted the guilt. What she did not accept, what she apparently continued not to accept in whatever internal register was available to her, was that the child was not real. The child was real. She knew it in the way that a woman 5 months along knows what is happening inside her body, and she had told the truth, twice in writing, and once to 12 men in a room, and had been told she was mistaken about her own condition. Whether there was a quality to those last days that can only be called a particular kind of abandonment. Being told that your knowledge of your own body is wrong, that the institution has determined a reality for you that contradicts your direct experience, whether that carried its own weight, separate from the fear of death, cannot be known from the documents that survive. What can be inferred is that she went to the scaffold still holding the truth of the child, still having said so, still unbelieved. The morning of the 2nd of July, 1778, was overcast. The ground was wet from the previous night's rain. Worcester had assembled a crowd, estimates vary, but several hundred people at minimum, on the common, which in the summer of 1778 would have smelled of cut grass and horse and the particular sweet rot of a crowd compressed in warm weather. The sound of it a low unresolved murmur that had not yet settled into the particular hush that preceded public execution. The scaffold had been built for 4. All 4 spaces were filled. Ezra Ross walked up. James Buchanan walked up. William Brooks walked up. And Bathsheba Spooner, last or nearly last, walked up with her hands bound, and what several witnesses who stood close to the scaffold later reported was visible to the eye. Evidence of pregnancy. These witnesses are not named in most subsequent accounts, but their testimony is preserved in enough secondary sources to constitute a pattern. People in the crowd could see what 12 physicians in a room had officially not found. She spoke. She gave a prepared statement, or one composed in the way that minds under extreme pressure compose things, working the same material over and over in the days preceding until the words have a shape. She did not claim innocence. This is documented across multiple accounts and is consistent with everything she had said from the night of the arrest. She acknowledged what she had done. She expressed, in language that the witnesses reported as genuine rather than performative, remorse for the death of Joshua Spooner and for the involvement of the men now standing beside her. "I acknowledge the justice of my sentence," she said, or words that the record has preserved in this form. "I have done what I am condemned for, and I do not dispute the judgment of this court." She paused, or the accounts suggest a pause, the moment before the next sentence. "But I am with child. I am carrying a living child. I ask you in the name of God, and in the name of whatever mercy this court has remaining, to consider what you are about to do." The crowd heard this. The women in the crowd heard this. Several of them, standing close enough to see her condition, are reported, in newspaper accounts from the days following the execution, to have wept. The accounts note this detail without commentary. The crowd had come to see a hanging, and some of them were weeping before it happened. The execution proceeded. 4 ropes, 4 drops. The specific physics of it the record does not require to be dwelt upon, and this narrative will not dwell on it. What the record states, all 4 were executed on the 2nd of July, 1778, on the Worcester Common, in the damp morning air. The crowd dispersed with the slow and somewhat dazed quality of crowds that have witnessed something that has moved them in a direction they had not expected. Worcester moved on into its summer, the war still present in the form of taxation and absent men, and news that arrived weeks old, the harvest a month away, the ordinary momentum of a functioning town absorbing the morning's event, as towns have always absorbed such events, which is to say imperfectly, and not entirely, and with a residue that surfaces in unexpected moments for some time afterward. The bodies were taken down. Dr. William Whiting performed the autopsy on Bathsheba Spooner that same day, or the following morning. The exact timing is not specified in all sources. He was a physician of standing in Worcester County, a man of some education, and his report, which has survived in the historical record in the form that makes it impossible to set aside, is a document of clinical precision. He noted the female subject, the approximate age, the manner of death. He noted the condition of the body, and he noted, with the same economical language in which he noted everything else, as though the significance of the finding required no additional emphasis to be legible, a male fetus, gestational age approximately 5 months, fully formed in the particulars, viable in the specific sense that the word carried in the record, a child that, had circumstances permitted, would have been born. Bathsheba Spooner had been telling the truth. The word viable sits in Whiting's report like a stone, placed carefully in a specific location. He did not editorialize. He did not address the panel's finding directly. He recorded what was in front of him. A male fetus, 5 months, viable. The document has survived 247 years. Timothy Ruggles, in the summer of 1778, was in Nova Scotia. He was building. The land grants from the Crown were beginning to materialize in the form of actual property, and the settlement of Loyalist exiles, in which he was a central figure, was acquiring the slow permanence of communities that intend to remain. He was 63 years old, and he had survived the loss of his Massachusetts estate and his American political identity, and he was making something new from the remaining material of his life, which required a particular quality of forward momentum. Whether word of his daughter's execution reached him that summer, or later, or in what form, a letter, a newspaper, a rumor passed through the network of Loyalist exile that connected the scattered communities across Nova Scotia and the maritime provinces, is not documented in any source that survives. There are no letters between Timothy Ruggles and Bathsheba that have come to light from any period of her life, let alone from the months of her imprisonment and trial. Whether this reflects a genuine estrangement, the casualty rates of paper documents over 2.5 centuries, or the simple logistical impossibility of correspondence across the divide of war and exile, all 3 remain possible. He lived until 1795. He was 80 years old approximately when he died in Nova Scotia, having outlived Bathsheba by 17 years. In the historical accounts that treat him, and they are numerous because his political career was genuinely significant, she appears rarely. A daughter, executed. The note is usually brief, followed by a return to his land grants, his community building, his eventual standing in the Loyalist settlement he had made from nothing. History followed the man who accumulated things, not the daughter who lost everything, what he carried of her in those 17 years, whether he grieved, whether the knowledge of the autopsy reached him, and what it did to him when it did, whether there was anything in him that registered the child who had not been born. The record is entirely silent on this. The silence is its own kind of document. The 4 children of Joshua and Bathsheba Spooner pass out of the historical record with almost no trace. They were living, at the time of the arrest, in the house in Brookfield. They were present in the way that children are present in adult catastrophe, absorbing what they can understand and what they cannot understand with equal completeness, the landscape of their life reorganizing around a fact too large to be processed in real time. Their names appear in enough documents to confirm their existence and approximate ages. Their subsequent lives do not appear in any source this record has found. The Spooner property passed through the mechanisms of the law to Joshua's heirs. The house on the Brookfield Road continued to stand, presumably for some years after, occupied by people who may or may not have known its history in detail, which is how most houses that have been the sites of significant events continue. Ezra Ross was buried, the accounts suggest, without particular ceremony. His family in whatever town he had come from, the records are not clear enough about his origins to state with confidence, received presumably word of his death. What they made of it, unknown. He had gone to war at 17 or 18, had survived battle, had been sick on a road, and had been taken in, and had died on a scaffold in Worcester at 19, having been obliging in a way that cost him everything. His story is part of Bathsheba Spooner's story, but it is also its own thing. A short life, not entirely of his own making, ending in a morning that he had not been born into a class or a time that equipped him to escape. James Buchanan and William Brooks died on the same scaffold, 2 British soldiers executed by the government of a country they had been fighting against. The irony of this, that enemy combatants would hang alongside the woman who had employed them, by a revolutionary court asserting its legal authority partly through their deaths, appears to have been noted by no contemporary source and has received limited attention in subsequent historical treatments. They were instruments in the account of Bathsheba Spooner. They were also persons, with whatever interior lives the record is too thin to reconstruct, who made choices and were killed for them, in a war that defined which choices were legitimate and which were not. The legal category under which Bathsheba Spooner was charged is worth dwelling on, because it illuminates the frame through which the court, the jury, and the government understood what she had done. Petty treason. The term is English in origin, inherited from the common law, and its logic is architectural. Certain relationships of subordination were so fundamental to social order that killing within them constituted not merely murder, but a particular kind of cosmic wrongness, an inversion of the natural hierarchy. A servant who killed a master, a wife who killed a husband. These acts were petty treason because they attacked the premise of the structure. The penalty was death. In England, until 1790, the prescribed penalty for women convicted of petty treason was burning, the more severe form reserved for the more severe violation. In Massachusetts in 1778, it was the rope, which was, depending on one's frame, either more merciful or merely less theatrical. The significance of this legal category is that it frames Bathsheba Spooner's act not primarily as a murder, terrible, yes, but legally categorizable alongside other murders, but as an act of domestic sedition. A wife had risen against a husband. The domestic order had been inverted. The state had a particular investment in making clear that it would not permit this, over and above its general investment in the punishment of murder. This investment aligns uncomfortably with the political context. The new government of Massachusetts, in July of 1778, was acutely engaged in the project of demonstrating its legitimacy. Every legal act was a statement. The execution of 4 convicted murderers, including the daughter of the most prominent loyalist in the region, including enemy soldiers, including a woman who had transgressed against the domestic order, served multiple demonstrations simultaneously. The law applied equally. The revolution protected property and domestic hierarchy, as well as political liberty. A loyalist's daughter received what the law provided, without favor. The new republic could be trusted to be a republic, which meant it could be trusted to hang people who had earned it, including those whose connections might have argued for clemency. Whether this political weight was consciously present in the chamber where the petitions were denied, or in the room where 12 physicians conducted their examination, whether any man involved in those proceedings was aware of making a decision shaped by political need rather than legal principle, is impossible to confirm. Men rarely document the operational assumptions of their decisions. What survives are the decisions themselves. The question of why she chose murder, why she did not choose other things, is one the record permits but cannot answer, and it is worth asking not in order to condemn or excuse, but because it is part of understanding who she was. She could have fled. The logistics of this were not simple, but they were not impossible. Women in the 18th century did leave marriages, did disappear into other identities, did find ways of surviving outside the domestic structures that had been assigned to them. The law made departure enormously difficult. A married woman had no legal standing to hold property, no automatic right to her children, no guaranteed access to her own earnings. But the law and the practical reality were not always the same thing, and the war had created enough disruption in the ordinary structures of life that a determined woman with some resources and some intelligence had more options than the peacetime law would suggest. She had intelligence. She had the kind of mind that produced 2 careful legal petitions under extreme duress. She had in Ezra Ross someone willing to follow her into something far worse than a flight north. She had in the chaos of a Massachusetts at war, with her father already in Nova Scotia, and the social structures of the county reorganizing around new loyalties, a moment of unusual possibility. She chose murder. She chose it deliberately, over time, in a way that the record makes clear was not impulsive. She said, "I wish to God Joshua was out of the world," and said it again, and said it again, and eventually it accumulated enough weight to become a plan, and the plan acquired the shape of 2 soldiers in a yard in the dark. Why this, and not departure? This is the question the record cannot settle. Whether she was angrier than flight would have served, whether something in the psychology of her situation, the years of it, the particular grinding quality of a long misery, had organized her desire in the direction of an ending for him, rather than a beginning for herself. Whether she loved Ezra Ross enough to want a life that began with him in it, and could not construct the geometry of that life, while Joshua remained in the house. Whether all of these were present at once, as motives rarely arrive singly, the record does not answer. The record shows us the choices. It does not illuminate the interior that made them. There is a temptation, in any account of this case, to locate its meaning in the pregnancy, to treat the petition and the panel and the autopsy as the moral center of the story, around which the murder and the trial are merely context. This temptation should be resisted, not because the pregnancy is not morally significant. It is profoundly, as the autopsy makes inescapable, but because the resistance to that simplification is part of what makes the story worth telling. Bathsheba Spooner conspired to murder her husband. This is documented. The documentation is not seriously in dispute. She desired it, planned it, employed men to carry it out, and was in the house when it happened. The court that convicted her was not wrong to convict her. The verdict of guilty was, by the law and the evidence available, correct, and she was 5 months pregnant when she was hanged, having told the truth about this to every authority with the power to act on it, and been disbelieved by all of them. The autopsy confirmed what she had said. The confirmation came too late to matter to her, though not too late to matter to the record. These 2 truths coexist in the same woman, in the same case, in the same July morning. The record insists on this coexistence. It will not allow the story to be cleaned up into either a simple account of justice served or a simple account of injustice. She was guilty of what she was convicted of. She was telling the truth about her pregnancy. Both are documented. Both are true. What the coexistence means, what it says about the new republic's first act of capital justice against a woman, about the structures of authority and knowledge that determined whose truth was admissible, about the particular form of institutional failure that allows 12 men to look at a 5-month pregnancy and find nothing. This is what the record asks and does not answer, and goes on asking. The title of this episode is a sentence. It is built from 3 documented facts in succession. She begged them to wait. They hanged her anyway. She was pregnant. Each clause is confirmed by surviving primary sources. Each, individually, is a fact. Together they are not merely a fact, but a verdict of a different kind than the one Worcester delivered, a verdict on the machinery of the delivery. She was not innocent of what she was convicted of. She was innocent of being wrong about her own body. The law, in 1778, had no mechanism for distinguishing between these two innocences. Or rather, it had a mechanism, the jury of matrons, the plea of the belly, the established principle of English common law that a woman quick with child could claim a stay of execution, and it declined to activate that mechanism with the rigor the situation required. Whether that declination was negligence or something more deliberate, the record, as noted, holds the question and withholds the answer. Whether any of the 12 physicians returning their verdict understood that they were wrong. Also unknown, whether the government, receiving Whiting's autopsy report, took any internal account of the discrepancy, any moment of institutional reckoning, any private acknowledgement in any chamber by any official that a woman had been hanged on the basis of findings that were incorrect. If such a moment occurred, it left no trace in the surviving record. The record contains the finding of the panel and the finding of the autopsy. It holds them side by side in the same archive without adjudication. This is what archives do. They preserve what happened. They do not apologize for it. The Revolution needed to be something. It needed, in July of 1778, to be the beginning of a thing that was worth the cost. Worth Valley Forge, worth the men dying in Pennsylvania and New York and Virginia, worth the confiscated estates and the fractured families, and the particular American violence of the thing. It needed to be justice. It needed to be a country where the law applied and meant something, and was not the mere instrument of a king's convenience. The first woman that country executed by court order of its own government was the daughter of one of that king's most loyal subjects. She had killed her husband. She had been convicted by a functioning court with evidence through due process, as that process was then understood. The Revolution could point to all of this and say, this is what justice looks like. It does not exempt the loyalists. It does not spare women. It is a republic, and it is the same law for everyone. The child in her body was not part of the case they were making. The child was a complication. The child required a stay of execution, a jury of matrons, a delay of months, and then, ultimately, a second execution. A woman who had just delivered, or the execution of an infant who had done nothing, or some other arrangement that none of the arrangements available resolved cleanly. The child was, in the political arithmetic of July 1778, an inconvenience, and the panel of 12 men produced, with whatever mixture of incompetence and convenience and political attunement to the moment, a finding that removed the inconvenience. They were wrong. The child was there. Bathsheba Spooner had been right, and the first act of the new nation's capital justice was to hang a woman and an unborn boy on the word of men who had looked and not seen, or had seen and not said. The fetus had no name. He would have been born in December, or thereabouts, a winter child in what would have been the third winter of American independence, if independence held, if the war resolved in the direction the Revolution needed it to resolve. He would have been born into a country still becoming what it was going to be, in which everything that happened in those first years was simultaneously an event and a precedent, a fact and a template for later facts. He would have had a name, had some arrangement of the preceding months gone differently, had Bathsheba not been arrested, or had the trial been delayed, or had 12 men looked more carefully. or had one of them found the courage to contradict a politically convenient conclusion. The record has his measurements. It does not have his name. Dr. Whiting recorded the gestational age, the sex, the condition. The record is complete in the way that clinical records are complete. Every observable fact noted, the facts that required being there noted, the facts that required a future not yet recorded as absent. His existence was confirmed too late to matter to him, too late to matter to his mother, not too late, evidently, to matter to a physician who wrote it down, signed his name, and filed the document in the archive where it has waited to be read for 2.5 centuries. The scaffold came down, Worcester continued. The war ground on through the summer of 1778 and into the autumn and the following year and the year after that, until Yorktown in 1781 and the peace in 1783, by which point Timothy Ruggles had been in Nova Scotia for 7 years and Bathsheba Spooner had been in the ground for 5. The Republic went on to become what it became. It established courts and constitutions and legal precedents and, eventually, standards of medical examination, though the latter arrived in useful form considerably later than the former. It executed more people, including more women, and in time developed a body of case law around the rights of the condemned that addressed, among other things, the question of pregnancy. The principle that a pregnant woman condemned to death was entitled to delay, the principle Bathsheba Spooner had invoked in both her petitions, was eventually formalized with more rigor than it had been in July of 1778. Eventually, what it chose in July of 1778 is also part of what it became. The first woman it executed died carrying a child it had officially determined did not exist. The determination was wrong. The record is clear. The child was there. Bathsheba Spooner's grave, if she received one, has not been definitively identified in surviving records. She may be in Worcester, in the churchyard, or in some less formal arrangement. She may have been returned, through some family mechanism, to Brookfield. The specifics are not preserved. This is not unusual for executed criminals of the period. The law's claim on the body did not always leave room for the ordinary customs of the deceased. She is remembered, in the historical record, under several designations. The first woman executed by the United States government, the Loyalist's daughter, the petitioner, the woman the panel said was not pregnant. These designations are all accurate. None of them is sufficient. She was also a woman who chose badly in a situation that offered her mainly bad choices, who reached for something that the law could not allow her, and arranged it in the only way available to her in the particular winter of 1777, who carried the consequences of that arrangement with a clarity that did not flinch, who told the truth about them consistently, and who was right about the one truth that might have changed what happened to her, and could not make anyone with the power to act on it believe her in time. The record does not ask us to forgive her for what she did. It asks something harder than that. It asks us to hold what she did, and what was done to her simultaneously, in the same gaze, without resolution, because the historical record rarely offers resolution, only documentation, and documentation is what we have. What the new nation's first act of capital justice against a woman looked like, when the physician finally described it on the examination table, was a mother and a 5-month-old boy who had no name and no grave and no place in any subsequent account that did not require a long explanation to reach. The record has his measurements. The record has her petitions. The rope is somewhere in the record too, though by now it has long since turned to dust, and the scaffold boards that were wet that morning, and the crowd that wept, and the 12 men who looked and returned their verdict, and the government that accepted it, and the July of 1778 that needed this to be over before it could be anything else. What the record does not have, what it has never had, what no archive in 247 years has produced, is any document in which the government of Massachusetts acknowledged that it was wrong.